Hello. All right. So we're gonna start chapter, oh gosh, I don't know, is it 30? I think it's 30. We only have 2 more chapters for this term, so we should have plenty of time to do that. All right, let me get my keynote open. Anyway, it's on plant reproduction. And so what I'm going to go over today is a short review of the life cycle of plants, and then I'm going to go over the life cycle of mosses, ferns, and conifers if there's time. Okay, so the first thing we want to remember is that a life cycle is all of the stages of an organism's growth and development. And for plants, that involves 2 alternate stages. I want you to keep in mind that for each individual plant, it doesn't mean that they go back and forth in their entire life, like between the sporophyte and the gametophyte stage. It just happens to be that in one life of a plant, they will have a sporophyte stage and a gametophyte stage. Now, depending on the kind of plant, one of those 2 stages will be the dominant stage in the life of that plant. That'll be part of what we go over as well. This life cycle is called alternation of generations. But I just want to make it clear again, it's when I say alternating stages, I don't mean they go back and forth multiple times throughout their life. They will start in one stage and they will move to the second stage. The sporophyte stage is diploid, or 2N, and the gametophyte stage is haploid. The way that I remember that is I just remember gamete is egg and sperm. And we've been learning for since last year that egg and sperm are haploid. So first we're going to look at moss. The dominant stage for moss is the gametophyte stage. That's if you ever like walk in the forest and you see a carpet of moss, the leafy green parts are the gametophytes. Now, the moss gametophytes have 2 reproductive structures, one male and one female. The male reproductive structure is called the antheridium. This is the phonetic pronunciation, so it's antheridium. And that's the male structure that produces sperm by mitosis. Remember, these are gametophytes. The stages of the plant, the stages of the plant life cycle are named based on the reproductive structures that they produce. So gametophytes produce gametes, sporophytes produce spores. The antheridium is the male reproductive structure in the gametophyte that produces sperm, and the archegonium, right? That's a weird thing, but archegonium is the female structure that makes eggs. Now, they do this through mitosis, which is also important to understand because they are gametophytes. Gametophytes are 1N, sperm and egg are both 1N. So going from 1N to 1N would be mitosis. 1 second, I'm gonna let Frank in. Come on, there we go. Come on. Admit, there you go. This is going to be different when we look at sporophyte. A sporophyte is 2N. They produce spores, which are 1N. Sorry, that looks like a Z. Oh, I thought that was here already. All right. So sporophytes are 2N. They produce spores, which are 1N. So these are going to be produced through meiosis because you're going from 2N to 1N. That's later on. But for gametophytes, they produce gametes. Both of those structures are 1N. So it's through mitosis. Antheridium, archegonium. So because it's a life cycle, you can pick anywhere in the cycle to start. I'm going to start here with the antheridium. And you see the sperm, archegonium produce the egg. So because Bryophytes, if you remember the group of non-vascular plants, we're talking about non-vascular plants. These are the mosses, liverwort, and hornwort. Because they're non-vascular, they have to grow in moist environments because they do not have xylem and phloem. It also means that because they live in moist environments, they're going to rely on water to spread the sperm. So sexual reproduction occurs during moist periods like the spring or rainy season. So when there's water around, the sperm are going to break out of the antheridia. Notice that a singular is antheridium and multiple antheridia. That's common in Latin. So sperm leave the antheridium and they swim to the archegonium. One sperm will fertilize an egg and that will form a diploid zygote. So we go from embryo here to, from zygote to embryo. So it's this process right in here. Once the egg is fertilized, it's a zygote. The zygote becomes the embryo. The embryo is going to develop into a sporophyte because remember we have sperm plus egg. Sperm is one N, egg is one N. When they fuse together, you form 2N sporophyte. So here's a picture and a diagram of the gametophyte sporophyte relationship in moss. The gametophyte is the dominant stage. This is the quote unquote carpet that you see when you see moss, and the sporophyte is this stalk with a capsule at the top. The capsule is where the spores are going to be formed and released from. And this is the reason why the gametophyte is the dominant stage, because the sporophyte is dependent on the gametophyte. It literally grows out of the gametophyte. The sporophyte begins as a thick stalk, which you see here and here, that grows from the tip of the gametophyte, and it stays attached to the gametophyte and depends on it for nourishment. Eventually, cells at the tip of the stalk form a structure called a sporangium, and that in the moss is called the capsule. Now, sporangium are going to be the spore-making structure. That's spore-making structure. So you've got the gametophyte, and up here, sporophyte. Okay, now we're up here in the cycle. We have the sporophyte. The cells in the capsules, as I mentioned in the previous slide, they have to go through meiosis because spores are 1N, but the sporophyte is 2N, and they're going to make identical spores. This is called homospory, if you recognize the prefix homo, meaning the same. So it's one type of spore. In other types of plants, you're going to have different kinds of spores, female spores and male spores. We'll get to that later. But homospory is the production of one type of spore. So we can call the life cycle of moss a homosporous alternation of generations. All of them are alternation of generations because of the sporophyte, gametophyte phases. But for moss, they produce one type of spore, homosporous. When the spores are mature, the capsule splits open and the spores are carried away by the wind or even water if it's raining. Any spore that lands in a good environment will grow into new gametophytes, which you see, you got the spores, they can grow little extensions. You've got buds here. Is the rhizoid. Have I talked about rhizoids yet? Yeah. Rhizoids are the root-like structures. Root-like structure. And the reason why I put root-like is because there's no xylem or phloem, so it cannot be a root. and then they develop into gametophytes. So it goes from gametophyte, gamete, actually, okay. So we've got gametophyte. This is for moss, what I'm drawing here. Got gametophyte, mitosis, egg and sperm. That's fertilization. Then you have sporophyte. Then you have meiosis, that's an M. And you've got spore, and then finally gametophyte. So that's the basic rundown of the life cycle of moss. Okay. Next is the life cycle of ferns. This is going to be very similar to the moss life cycle. Most species of ferns are also homosporous. And like the moss, the sporophyte grows from the gametophyte. But here's where we differ. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, the sporophyte is the dominant generation for ferns. Just write that again, ferns. Whereas for the moss, the gametophyte is the dominant stage. So now we go to sporophyte. In fact, moss and non-vascular plants are the only plants that have the gametophyte as the dominant stage. Every other species of plant, the sporophyte is the dominant stage. Okay, so we've got in the yellow box, we have the diploid sporophyte generation. In the blue box, we have the haploid gametophyte generation. So we start with the gametophyte. Okay, so the gametes are really tiny. They're about 10 millimeters in diameter. They are flat and also anchored by rhizoids, these little things down here. It kind of reminds me, if you've ever seen the movie Alien, reminds me of that thing that like attaches to people's faces and like puts the alien in your chest. If you haven't, then okay, you have no idea what I'm talking about. Anyway, so here you can see we've got the archegonium, same thing as the female structure that produces the egg. This is the antheridium. They haven't labeled it, but that's the antheridium. There's sperm there. So this is the same. You've got the antheridium and the archegonium. They're on the same gametophyte. The antheridium will make sperm that will be transferred to the archegonium. And here is the gametophyte. And you see the sporophyte starting to grow out of the gametophyte. So those are the rhizoids, and that's the flat part of the gametophyte. So the antheridium and the archegonium are on the lower surface. So they're basically underneath there. Again, when water is present, the sperm are released by the antheridia. They swim to the archegonia, and one sperm will fuse with the egg in the archegonium. The zygote forms, develops into an embryo, which becomes the sporophyte. Everything is same from moss. Eventually, you will have the young sporophyte form. And here's another difference with moss. The fern sporophyte is the dominant stage. It is not dependent on the gametophyte for nourishment. It crushes it, like literally physically crushes the gametophyte to death as it grows. I mean, you've seen ferns. They're big plants. They're much bigger than 10 millimeters. So of course, the gametophyte is going to get crushed. The mature fern sporophyte usually has compound leaves, which we call fronds. That's when you've got the stem that comes out and you've got these very long, thin leaflets. It's kind of not too horrible, but this whole thing is a frond. That's a compound leaf. Remember, compound leaf means for, let's see, this would be the petiole. And this would be your main branch. The fronds grow from an underground stem called a rhizome. Certain cells on the underside of the fronds develop into the sporangia. Remember, the actual fern is the sporophyte. So like in, sorry, it's going to come up again. For the moss, you have the gametophyte, little fuzzy green thing, and you've got the sporophyte, which grows out. This is the sporangia for the moss. For ferns, they're going to grow on the underside of the leaflets. So there we go. Those, each little black dot is sporangia. Now, in a lot of ferns, the sporangia, as you see here in the picture, they're grouped in clusters. Each cluster is called a sorus. The plural of sorus is sori. Sorry. And again, because the sporophyte is 2N, but spores are 1N, they have to go through meiosis. So we cut the number of chromosomes in half, and they form haploid spores. At maturity, the sporangium opens and the spores are catapulted or carried by wind. So each of that is a sporangia. Bam, licks them out. See the spores. Okay, and finally we have conifers. Conifers are what do you call that? It's one phylum called Conifer under the seed what do you call it? Seed vascular plants. But they are gymnosperms, they are naked seeds. So this is an example of a vascular seed plant. The reason why we use moss and fern, the moss represents non-vascular. The ferns represent vascular seedless. And the gymnosperms or conifers represent vascular seed plants, but this doesn't include the flowering plants. Angiosperms have their very own section in this chapter on how they reproduce because flowers make it complicated. So moss and fern they produce one type of spore, so that's called homospory. Gymnosperms produce two types of spores. We have the microspore, which is male, and the megaspore, which is female. A really easy way to remember this, I'm sure you understand what mega and micro mean, big and little. And just remember the difference in sizes between egg and sperm. Eggs are huge, sperms small, so females are bigger. Microspores are going to grow into male gametophytes. Megaspores grow into female gametophytes. So of course, because it's a male gametophyte, it's going to be called microgametophyte, and female gametophytes are going to be called megagametophyte. So in the plant life, micro represents male, mega represents female. You probably don't remember because it feels like it was like a half a year ago, but when I talked about the cones of conifers, female cones are large and they are by themselves, male cones are small, and that's another reason why we use micro and mega. So the life cycle is referred to as heterospory, right? Hetero meaning different. We have male spores and female spores, so it's called a heterosporous alternation of generations. The life cycle of the conifers shows how seed plants reproduce without water. Pine trees are an example of a conifer. They cannot sexually reproduce until they're mature, which can take up to 30 years. So the life cycle of gymnosperms is long. These trees live, or these plants, I should say, a lot of them are trees. These plants live for a long, long time, like thousands of years. In fact, I think the oldest living organism is a plant. During the summer, the tree produces separate male and female cones. Remember, as I said, the male cones are small and they are grouped in like they're grouped together. Male cones are going to make microsporangia and female cones make megasporangia. So we are here, we're at an adult sporophyte. Here are the cones through meiosis, because sporophytes have to go through meiosis to produce spores. So we've got the microspore here and the megaspore. So the microspore forms a microgametophyte, megaspore produces megagametophyte. You can see here it says pollen. Pollen is the microgametophyte, and that is true. Okay. And I just went through, oh, no, I gotta do integument. Okay, so for the megaspore develops into the megagametophyte. These are eggs inside the megagametophyte, and this is the overall structure of the megagametophyte. This extra, like orangey layer around the outside, that's called the integument. There's a thick layer of cells that surrounds and protects the eggs. You can see here, there's a small opening that's called the micropyle. This is where the sperm can go through. So you can see there's a sperm right there. The megasporangium and the integument form the ovule, this whole thing. Now, on each side of a female cone, you can see here, there's 2 ovules on each side, on each scale, sorry. So 1, 2. Okay, I mentioned that already. Now, male cones are going to release large amounts of pollen grains that will travel on the wind, but only a few grains may actually reach a female cone. Remember, I told you that when, well, maybe you probably don't remember, but when a female cone is ready for pollination, the scales open up so that the pollen grains can drift between the scales until they find that opening here, the micropyle. So the process of a pollen grain at the micropyle is called pollination. Pollination is separate from fertilization. Just because there's a pollen grain here with sperm doesn't mean an egg is fertilized. Now, in the micropyle, there's usually a drop of fluid, which then dries up. As it dries up, it draws the sperm, or it draws the pollen grain into the integument. After pollination, the female gametophyte is going to produce an archegonia and eggs. The pollen grain is going to end up developing what's called the pollen tube, which you can see here. Because the pollen grain doesn't go all the way inside, the pollen grain will stay here, and then the pollen tube develops until it reaches an egg. Unlike the sperm of seedless plants, the sperm don't have to swim in water, so they don't have a tail. This is a huge adaptation for plants because now they don't need water to reproduce. The pollen tube takes about a year to grow to reach the egg that's only a few millimeters away. While the pollen tube is developing, 2 sperm develop inside the pollen tube. When the pollen tube reaches the archegonium, 1 sperm is going to unite with the egg to form a zygote. The other sperm, well, I can't talk. The other sperm and the pollen tube die. Over the next few months, the zygote develops into an embryo, and as the ovule matures into a seed. And this is an example of a pine tree. So that's why this is what a pine seed looks like. And it has these little wings on it to help carry it in the wind.
A pine is a common conifer found all over the northern hemisphere. It can be used as a model for the seed production process in all gymnosperms. The adult sporophyte, the pine tree, develops male and female cones on separate branches. Female cones develop two ovules on the upper surface of each cone scale. Each ovule contains haploid megaspores. Male cones produce microspores by meiosis. The microspores develop into pollen grains. Each winged pollen grain is a four-celled male gametophyte. The female gametophyte grows, producing two or more archegonia, each of which contains an egg. During pollination, a wind-borne pollen grain falls near the opening in one of the ovules of the female cone. Each male gametophyte forms a pollen tube that penetrates the tissue of the female gametophyte. When the pollen tube has grown into the archegonium, a sperm cell from the male gametophyte fertilizes the egg. The zygote develops into an embryo and a mature seed is produced. The female cone opens, releasing the seeds. When conditions are favorable, the seed germinates into a new, young sporophyte, a pine tree seedling.
Seed plants benefit from having a life cycle with microscopic gametophytes. They are enclosed in structures that are made by the much larger sporophyte. So not only do they not need water for the sperm to travel to the egg, but the gametophytes are actually, they actually grow on, and I do believe they're kind of parasitic towards the sporophyte. These structures, as I said before, allow for fertilization to happen without water. So reproduction can occur anytime. It doesn't have to be a specific time of year.